In this module of our discussion on labor unions, we're going to take a look at the effect of labor strikes, their effect in the households, the firms, and perhaps even a little bit on the unions themselves. First, let's consider that unions are there to represent the union workers to the firms, and they're there to extract some gains for the workers from the firms. Well, we have to think about how unions are able to do that, of course. And they do it by being able to exercise some leverage over the firms. Well, what leverage do they have? Well, the worker, of course, is able to slow down their work. The worker is able to provide a lower quality of output of their work. And finally, in the most severe circumstances, the worker is able to walk out and go on strike. And we're not talking about just one or two workers going on strike, maybe hampering the firm in a mild way, but more often than not, when workers go on strike in a firm, it's a large number of workers and serves to hamper the firm significantly or even shut down the firm for a period of time, which is a significant problem for the firm itself. So as we want to take a look at this, we need to think about who wins in the wage negotiation process. What are the short-run effects, the long-run effects, and then we'll take a look at some wage price spiral that might actually transpire as we experience strikes and such. So first, who wins in the wage negotiation process? Well, in the wage negotiation process, let's assume that there is no strike. The worker wins in the short term. The worker receives a higher wage for doing the same work, and that brings about greater utility for the worker, more income to expend on goods and services. They're happier. At least that's as we tell the story. But in the longer term, we can't expect that increase in utility remains. In the longer term, if we have a firm in a competitive market, we have a profit maximizing firm, a firm seeking profit, then we have to expect that as the firm's input prices rise, that the firm will raise output prices. So as the wage rises, in order for the firm to maintain a constant profit margin, the firm is going to increase prices to customers. And as firms do this generally, this will increase prices across the board, which will then go ahead and yield some level of inflation, such that after some period of time, the worker no longer has the extra buying power. The cost of goods and services around them has increased such that their real wage has likely returned to a level that it was at previously. So in the short run, the worker clearly benefits. In the long run, really no one benefits. In fact, sometimes the firm will even need to raise prices to the point where it can make up for lost ground. And so we think about this as a wage price spiral. As wages go up, it forces firms or motivates firms to increase prices. As they do so, then the worker experiences inflation in the general market, and their wage then settles back down to the same real wage it was at earlier. One of the alternatives, and we're seeing this throughout the economy, especially as we've come out of recession here over the last 6 or 7 years, one of the alternatives is that workers are caused to work harder, work longer, work more intensively in order to justify this higher wage, if you will. And when I say that we've seen this coming out of recession, we haven't seen it because workers are receiving higher wages. We see that they're really not. But we see that in order for firms to regain some profit margin and to make up for lost ground, if you will, there's tremendous pressure put on workers such that they're working harder, and so they diminish some utility. Well, if you've had an increase in utility because of an increase in wage, and then a decrease in utility because of work intensity, the net effect may be a net zero gain for the worker. And yet finally an alternative is we see when firms are facing higher wage costs that very often they'll be motivated to exchange labor for capital and replace workers, which creates yet a different problem all of its own. And clearly it's that effect in our marketplace to either increase capital, such as having robotics enter into the equation, or to move the job into another marketplace that creates problems for the workers and for the unions themselves. So as we think about this, we want to think about who or how we can model the effect of strikes. That's the ultimate tool that labor unions have. So let's think about the effects of strikes on the firm and on workers. And we do that through what we refer to as the Hicks bargaining model. In this model, we have the expected length of strike, or S, on the x-axis, and we have a percentage wage increase, which will simply generalize as W, on the y-axis. In this, we see some curve representing the offer made by the union, or OU, offer made by the union, and some curve represented by the firm's offer made by the firm. And of course, firms offer in the negotiation process a lower amount than that which is requested by the union or the union's offer, and that's what creates then this disparity through which they have to negotiate, bargain, etc. You see a rather interesting form begin to develop here for the union offer curve. We normally would expect to see some downward sloping curve. But in this case, we very often observe that in the earliest time of the strike, so this is expected length of strike, so in the earliest days or weeks of a strike, we actually will sometimes see that the union will go from having requested some dollar amount, let's call it W prime, and we'll see that that'll increase, which doesn't make a lot of intuitive sense to us unless you think about what the union's role is. The union's role is to use their power and their leverage. And here, if this strike has begun and the firm is offering a low amount and the union wants a high amount, as the strike begins in its earliest or nascent stages, the union may exercise some bravado, might say, look, if you're not going to accede to our demands, we're going to actually increase our demands. And so you'll see this bubble or this hump form before there's been enough time that both sides start to settle down. Now, sometimes you see just the opposite effect, which I really haven't modeled for you in this curve, but you'll see just the opposite effect on part of the firm. We sometimes will see the firm's curve dip down from its original level before it starts to head back up. Again, exercising some bravado, kind of, well, we'll show you if you're going to engage in a strike. But after some period of days, we see that both sides begin to mellow. The firm begins to mellow because, frankly, going without workers is problematic for a firm. Either they're needing to bring in other workers that are not as well trained, not loyal to the firm at all, not familiar with the culture that needs to be on the production floors, etc. You'll see the firm starts to lose money and they'll start to weaken. Similarly, labor unions, which really are simply representatives of workers and their households, begin to weaken as households start to go without income. I think I mentioned in an earlier module that I come from a family where my father was very proud to be part of a labor union. My mother and my siblings and I were less excited about this because what that meant to us was that every couple of years my father's union would put the union workers on strike, and we would go for weeks or months without an income. And in our household that was a relatively low income household to begin with, that created significant stress. And so that's what we saw of the labor union. My father, on the other hand, while he experienced that, what he also saw was the brotherhood. He also saw this union having extracted significant long-term gains for him in terms of pension benefits, etc., or at least what he saw as long-term gains. So we see this model form where over time, the firm begins to weaken and they'll raise their offer. as time goes on. And the labor union will begin to weaken and ultimately begin to reduce their demands as time goes on until we get to some point where the offer of the firm and the offer of the union have reached an equilibrium. That gives us some S star, or some length of time for the strike, the expected length of time of the strike, and some W star, some expected percent increase in wages. Let's actually take a look at one of these models and go ahead and motivate some equations. Here we'll begin with the offer curve from the union being parameterized by WU equals 5 plus 0.02S minus 0.01S squared. And then WF, or the offer from the firm, being parameterized by 1 plus 0.02S. And this is going to give us some equality, because we can put these equations equal to one another, of course. So as we do that, let's look at this. 5 plus 0.02S minus 0.01S squared equaling 1 plus 0.02S. When you look at this at first, you may think of using a quadratic equation. We have a constant, a scalar, and an exponent. So you might think of the quadratic equation. Don't be tempted yet to do that. Before you go to the point or the extent of putting together a quadratic equation to find the equality, let's see if maybe one of these variables will be removed as we set these equal to each other, which is what happens in this case. So if you look at this, if we subtract 0.02S from both sides of the equation, we find that it gets rid of both of these terms, and we're left with 5 minus 0.01S squared being equal to 1, or 0.01S squared being equal to 4. And that's the first place we can take this. Now we'll divide both sides by 0.01, such that we have S squared equals 400. So 4 divided by 0.01 is 400. And then in order to get rid of this exponent, literally, we will apply the root, the squared root to each side, which essentially takes this exponent and divides it by 2. So now 2 divided by 2 is 1. S to the 1, or anything to the 1, is simply its own value. So we are going to end up with S is equal to the square root of 400, and the square root of 400 is 20. So S star is 20. And now with that, we can identify our W star. So W will be equal to 1 plus 0.02 times 20, or 1 plus 0.4, or 1.4. So W star is equal to 1.4, which we recognize is 1.4%. So in this case, we see that this strike may be expected to last for 20 periods of time, 20 days, 20 weeks, after which the workers and firms will agree to a wage increase of 1.4%. I haven't given you a shape here that necessarily, or an equation that will necessarily give the exact same shapes that we have driven in this model that I showed you a moment ago. But we're probably looking at something such that we have this curve develop for the firm. This is the offer for the firm. Offer for the firm. And this curve develop for the offer for the union, such that we see a W star and S star develop as follows. And again, this is simply a model that we see can be employed to identify the expected length of a strike, and after the expected length of the strike, the expected wage gain. Now, you would suppose that if we can see this kind of a model, if we can motivate the model, then the two sides might be better served just to sit down for 5 minutes, motivate the model, and say, okay, Rather than go through a 20-week strike, let's just agree to the 1.4% wage increase. Or the workers might say, well, gosh, I'd rather go without a wage increase than suffer a 20-week strike and not have the income. But these models are highly theoretical, of course, harder to observe and motivate in reality, certainly beforehand, than to do so after the fact. So really we see that we can observe these things and then apply equations to that which we've observed. But this is the Hicks bargaining model, and it gives us an idea as to how to think about the effect of strikes and how to visualize and parameterize the power and influence that firms, or rather unions, may have over firms.